Okay. Hello. It's nice seeing everybody at the penultimate LRCCS talk, or maybe penultimate. I can't tell anymore. I'm losing track of time. So I'm Miranda Brown. I know many of you, of course, or many of you have the displeasure of knowing me. So I'm here to welcome you to the LRCCS Tuesday lecture series. And I wish to thank you welcome to the 10th and final presentation in the noon lecture series, even though we have one more tomorrow, of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies for winter 2025. The lecture series will resume in fall term 2025. Hooray! And the complete schedule of talks will be available at that time. I begin with a few announcements. On this coming Wednesday, April 23rd at 12 noon, Jeffrey Regal, Professor Emeritus of UC Berkeley and the University of Sydney, how did he swing that? I don't know, will be speaking on Propriety, Ambition, and Courage, The Unmoved Heart of Monks, the 2A2 Revisited. His talk will take place in room 1330 of Mason Hall, that's the honors office, at noon. A flyer is available here today, co-sponsored by the LSA Honors Program, which is offering space in my poster-making talents, and the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies. On this coming Thursday, just in case you are looking for extra things to do at the end of the semester, April 24th at 2:30 p.m., the Department of Communications Global Media and Communication Collective will present Social Media and Ordinary Life, Affect, Ethics, and Aspiration in Contemporary China, a book conversation panel featuring UM professors Kara Wallace, Sylvia Lintner, Eli Wu, where are you, Eli? There you are, and Pranav Malhotra. I think I butchered that one. The event will take place in the North Quad Event Space, 2435. It is free and open to the public. A flyer is available here today, and come and cheer on Sylvia and Ely, please. Now I get to introductions. So today's presentation will be given by Hilary Smith, Associate Professor of History at the University of Denver. She writes about the history of science and medicine in China. She is the author of Forgotten Disease, Illnesses Transformed in Chinese Medicine, Stanford 2017, and is currently finishing a book about nutritional imperialism. She has received a Fulbright US Scholar Grant, as well as support from the National Endowment of the Humanities, which I guess is it RIP'd yet? Okay, well, and the Chiang Ching-Kuo Foundation and other awards. Today, she will be speaking on nutritional imperialism, how science turned difference into sickness in China. Please join me in welcoming her and turn off your cell phone ringers. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me? Thanks to Miranda for inviting me, and Miranda has been very important to my learning more about the history of food in China, and I'm very grateful for that. I also wanted to thank Ina Schlorf for making all of the arrangements that made my visit possible. I'm very grateful. And to all of you for being here on what I understand is the last day of classes of the semester, which must be a very busy time and a time of transition. So thanks for making the time to be here. What I'm going to share with you all today is a piece or a couple of pieces of a nearly completed book. And the working title of the book is the same as the title of this talk, Nutritional Imperialism, How Science Turned Difference into Sickness in China. It's a critical look at the history of nutrition science. I argue that modern nutrition science has often made Chinese bodies appear to be sickly and has made Chinese diets look like they cause sickness. Chinese intellectuals and leaders have on the one hand participated in and on the other resisted or complicated that pathologization. So what do I mean by nutritional imperialism? This is my definition. Nutritional imperialism is the belief that the way people of Northern European descent eat and the way their bodies metabolize food are universal global standards for healthy diet. This is usually not stated so explicitly, it's usually implicit. But there are a couple of assumptions that follow from this. One is that eating patterns that differ from the European standard are seen as defective, and people nourished by those different eating patterns are seen as less healthy. And another is that people whose bodies or diets deviate from the European standard are seen as requiring state or industrial or pharmaceutical correction of some sort. Now, when I frame it this way, nutritional imperialism is not specifically about China. And certainly early 20th century Western hubris about other people's diets was expansive and all-inclusive. It targeted African, South American, Indigenous American, and Asian foodways with equal relish. But China occupied a special place in the imaginations of early nutrition scientists. In the second half of the 19th century, when American scientists were carving the cornerstone of nutrition science, immigration was bringing Chinese people and foodways into American consciousness as they never had been before. What Chinese workers ate was a fixation of American labor leaders and politicians. On the one hand, they dismissed what they saw as insufficient and monotonous diets of Chinese immigrants, but on the other, they feared Chinese workers' ability to work tirelessly on such fare. In 1882, the Chinese became the first group ever to be barred from immigration to the United States on the basis of their nationality. And that attests to the anxieties that accompanied Chinese identity in the society where early nutrition science research was happening. At the same time, Western missionaries and medical men living in China expressed admiration for the healthfulness of Chinese diets, especially when compared with their own countrymen. And Americans supporting alternative views of healthy diets, such as vegetarians, were also pointing to Chinese foodways as exemplary. And although by the early 20th century, many Western observers had come to perceive China dismissively as the sick man of Asia, they still recognized China as having had a remarkable past and representing a major venerable civilization in its own right. So, whether viewed positively or negatively, China was very much on the minds of early nutrition scientists. And because China loomed large for these scientists, it should loom large in our histories of nutrition science as well. So let me make this a little bit more concrete here. In the book, I examined 5 examples at length, and each example is the focus of one chapter of the book. So there's a chapter on the concept that so-called Oriental bodies processed food more slowly than so-called Occidental bodies, comparative racial metabolism studies. There's a chapter on arguments that eating rice was less healthy than eating wheat, and we'll look at that today. There's a chapter on arguments that Chinese people consumed too little animal protein, one on the concept of lactose intolerance, and one on the concept of aldehyde dehydrogenase deficiency, which is usually more colloquially referred to as Asian flush induced by alcohol consumption. Many of the examples that I look at, certainly the first 3 listed here, are concepts that first emerged in the early 20th century at the height of the age of European imperialism. At that time, what many people understood as representative elements of a Western European diet were the things that the food historian Rachel Lawton has described as European power cuisine. And they included things like lots of meat, especially beef, wheat, dairy, whether in the form of cheese or fresh milk. And I'd add, though Lawton doesn't include this in her formulation, alcohol, particularly wheat and barley-derived alcohol. By contrast, Western observers and some Chinese modernizers saw Chinese diets as being nearly vegetarian, and even when the Chinese did eat meat, it was the wrong kind of meat. They thought it was pork rather than beef, lacking dairy almost completely, centering on rice rather than wheat, and not drinking much alcohol. In an age of lopsided power and wealth, scientists turned those perceived dietary differences into explanations. And I say perceived dietary differences because East-West dietary differences weren't actually as clear as nutrition scientists made them out to be. So, for example, the idea that the Chinese ate too little meat would have surprised many well-to-do Chinese people in the early 20th century, including the diplomat Wu Tingfang, who spent much of the 1910s trying to convince other elite Chinese not to eat so much meat. And the wine-soaked verses of Chinese poets might have made observers a little bit skeptical of the idea that Chinese people were inherently teetotalers. But be that as it may, the simplistic assumption prevailed that Chinese diets differed from Western ones in these characteristic ways. And then rather than just being differences, they came to be seen as deficiencies. Deficiencies that made Chinese bodies, minds, and states weak and helped to explain and naturalize the existing political order. So that's the overarching concept of the book. And what I want us to look at this morning, or this afternoon, is a couple of these examples in a little more detail. So we'll talk about rice sickness, we'll talk about the chapter on rice, and a little bit about the chapter on lactose intolerance. So to start with rice, rice was prominent in the diets of Chinese laborers who migrated to North America from the southeastern part of China in the 19th century. And so Western scientists at the time saw rice as the characteristic staple food of Chinese civilization. Never mind that wheat dominated in the northern part of China, or that even in the south, mixed grains were common because other grains were cheaper than rice. And here, I want to briefly talk about Chinese ideas about rice and health before the 20th century. And my purpose with this slide is not to suggest that there is some sort of timeless Oriental wisdom about rice that we ought to revere, but I just want to give a sense of how much more specific and contextual knowledge about rice was in classical Chinese dietetic texts. Those texts discussed rice as one of the gu, and gu is on the upper left-hand side of the slide here. Sometimes this is translated as grain, but it's more accurately something like substantial, starchy, plant-based foods that were central to meals. And rice was only one of these, one of many different gu, including lots of other things that we think of as grains, barley, wheat, many different kinds of millet, and also different kinds of beans. And on the right side of the slide here, the excerpt of an 18th century dietetic text is showing how different types of rice were presented as having different properties according to a 5-part matrix of qualities. And so, for example, rice grown in one region, say rice grown in a more southern place, might be associated with the flavor sweet and the thermal nature warming, while rice grown in a different region might be associated with the flavor bitter and the thermal nature cooling, and so forth. The point is that these texts present rice as an important food, but not the central food. It's just one part of a diverse diet, and its health effects are framed contextually. They depended on rice's origin, its type, the season, the eater's constitution, the eater's phase of life, their condition, and things like that. But over the course of the 19th century, in places like England, the concept of the staple food emerged. And with it, the idea that different civilizations had different staples. And so the example I've given here is from a speech given by the president of the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1898 about wheat as the staple grain of Western civilization. And he wrote, "Wheat is the most sustaining food grain of the great Caucasian race. We are born wheat eaters. Other races vastly superior to us in numbers, but differing widely in material and intellectual progress, are eaters of Indian corn, rice, millet, and other grains, but none of these grains have the food value, the concentrated health-sustaining power of wheat. And it is on this account that the accumulated experience of civilized mankind has set wheat apart as the fit and proper food for the development of muscle and brains." Now, expressions like this, people like Crookes were expressing a popular view that subsisting on rice made a people effete, weak, and passive, all of the stereotypes that had attached to China by this time. And that's more or less the kind of prejudice that you would expect from a popular 19th century American or British source. And although Crookes was a scientist, and a well-respected scientist, he was not a nutrition scientist. His expertise was in physics and chemistry. So maybe this kind of hubris isn't that surprising. But what interests and exercises me is that by the 1920s, the idea that rice eating makes a person weak had become an article of faith in nutrition science. So how did this happen? Well, it had something to do with the vitamin deficiency disorder called beriberi. This is a disease that people get when their diets don't contain enough thiamine. And in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there were dramatic widespread outbreaks of beriberi in the Japanese military, in prisons and hospitals in Southeast Asia, and among Chinese plantation laborers and factory workers, and elsewhere, but largely in East and Southeast Asia. The people who suffered from beriberi weren't getting enough thiamine in their diets, which consisted largely of rice. Observing this, leading Western nutrition scientists, such as Elmer Werner McCollum and Robert McCarrison, began to say things like this about rice. So McCollum, in a lecture, said that rice is deficient in all known vitamins, protein, and in several inorganic elements. Owing to the multiple deficiencies of the rice diet, it is not possible to decide as to the specific effects of deficiency or lack of a single dietary component. In other words, there are so many things wrong with a rice diet, we can't even itemize them all. And McCarrison called rice a relatively poor cereal at best. Now, the scientists weren't wrong about the poverty of diets that resulted in clinical beriberi. Those diets were, in fact, insufficient. But it wasn't rice that was the problem. The problem was that the diets of prisoners, soldiers, factory workers, and the like were very limited. The institutions responsible for feeding those populations had an incentive to do it as cheaply as possible, and that meant giving them mostly rice and not much else. In the early 20th century, that also meant feeding them steam-milled rice, that is, rice that was dehusked and polished by steam-powered machines rather than by hand. Steam-milled rice could be processed in larger amounts, it could be transported more cheaply, it would keep longer than rice milled by more traditional methods, and so it was cheaper than hand-milled rice. But unfortunately, it was also less nourishing because the steam milling stripped the rice of its vitamin B-containing bran much more efficiently than hand milling had done. So the reason why beriberi was such a big problem in early 20th century China had to do with the emergence of these modern total institutions in which some segments of the population were eating all their meals. It had to do with how modern food processing technology stripped food of its nutrients. It was not an ancient problem, and it was not really a rice problem. But it made rice look like a problem to nutrition scientists, and thanks to decades of popular disparagement of the so-called rice-eating nations, those scientists were already predisposed to suspect that there was something wrong with the grain. So they ended up giving scientific backing to popular prejudices against cuisines that featured rice. And the idea of rice's unhealthiness wasn't confined to Western sources. It appeared in Chinese sources too. Newspapers such as Shenbao often reported on developments in science, and articles like the one that's excerpted here reflected the nutritionist's suspicion of rice. So this is an article that compared the nutritional value of rice with wheat and concluded that wheat was better. And among the reasons that it offers that wheat is better than rice nutritionally is that it's easier to digest, it's more energy rich, it has more nutrients, very vague, Ziyangfen, and that feeding rice exclusively to animals causes them to die within a few weeks, but if you feed wheat exclusively to animals, the article claimed, it keeps them alive. And then, of course, one of the items was the inevitable mention of beriberi, that wheat cures beriberi, whereas rice causes it. What the basis of some of these claims is unclear. But they resonate with the research that top Chinese nutrition scientists such as Wu Xian were conducting at the time. Wu Xian has sometimes been called the father of Chinese biochemistry. He trained in the US at MIT and Harvard as a member of the first generation of Boxer Indemnity students in the 1910s. He then returned to China and took up a position at Peking Union Medical College. And by the 1920s, he was feeding carefully controlled diets to rats in his laboratory. And when he published this research, he presented it in explicitly national terms. So in this example that I've given here with this, poorly reproduced image from his book, Introduction to Nutrition, he refers to the diet that produced the heavier rats on the left side as the American diet, and the one that produced the lighter rats on the right side as the Chinese diet. It's easy to come away from an illustration like this with the message that the Chineseness of the diet is problematic, or that poor diet is characteristically Chinese while good diet is characteristically American. And this is the kind of research, I suggest, that informed articles like the Shenbao article that we've just seen. Another reason why this connection between rice and smallness or weakness got traction in China was that the rice versus wheat demarcation had long been prominent within Chinese foodways and not just between Chinese and Western foodways. Chinese articles from the 1920s comparing rice with wheat, they contrast the physique of wheat-eating Northerners and rice-eating Southerners as often as they contrast the physique of Chinese and Westerners. So the idea that wheat eating promotes a more robust physique mapped onto a pre-existing Chinese idea quite well. Now, what I've been showing you here are examples from the 1920s. But one of the things that's interesting to me is that nutritional imperialism does not seem to have receded as the age of formal imperialism did. So why not? Well, by the post-war period, the notion that rice was nutritionally problematic was baked into the assumptions of people in charge of intergovernmental organizations, such as the World Health Organization and the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization. Witness the so-called Rice Study Group that the FAO convened in India in May and June of 1947. The group's charge was to tackle what they called, quote, the rice problem in all its aspects. Although the report they published did not explicitly articulate what the rice problem was, reading between the lines suggests that it was widespread hunger. People whose diets had come to include a large proportion of rice had not been getting enough to eat. And indeed, the 1940s had seen many grim episodes of starvation in South and East Asia, and I've given a few examples here on the map. This was not, it seems unnecessary to say, a rice problem. True, rice constituted a significant part of the diets of people in each of these areas. Most had also, however, experienced the severe dislocations of war. And they had also, significantly, been under colonial occupation at the time of their famines. Bengal was a British colony, Vietnam and Java first under French and Dutch occupation and then Japanese rule, and Japan occupied by the US. The distribution of food had to some degree been controlled by a distant metropolitan government. And yet the solutions that the Rice Study Group came up with had to do with improving rice, raising yields, using different methods of processing and storage, for example. They also encouraged a move away from rice as a staple food. Such approaches may have been beneficial, but they didn't address the main causes of hunger and malnutrition in 1940s Asia. So the point is that intergovernmental organizations that had accepted nutritional dogma were one factor that perpetuated nutritional imperialism after the war. Another one was the economic incentives of post-war governments. And to illustrate this point, I'll briefly describe how people in Taiwan became wheat eaters. In the mid-1950s, the Taiwanese government arranged to start buying loads of discounted American wheat. This served two purposes. One, it helped the US government offload the agricultural surplus that it had purchased from American farmers, who had been producing way more wheat than they could sell. And two, it offered the Taiwanese government a way to bring in badly needed foreign currency. So they'd induce farmers to swap their rice for American wheat, and then the government would sell Taiwanese rice abroad to bring in foreign money. The stumbling block was that at this time, Taiwanese people didn't eat much wheat. The staple ratio in Taiwanese diets in 1956 was about 76% rice, 23% sweet potatoes, and 1% wheat. So for this scheme to work, the Taiwanese government had to somehow convince Taiwanese people to start eating more wheat. And one of the ways that they did this was by promoting wheat at public occasions, such as the one shown here, this 1964 Development Expo, where the economic minister, Li Guoding, is sampling donuts. And another way that they tried to do this was by promoting wheat's nutritional value. And here they drew on this problematic body of wheat-boosting, rice-disparaging nutrition science that in its turn had been built on imperialist hubris about rice-eating nations. So this is an excerpt from a 1968 message from the Taiwan Provincial Grain Bureau to farmers, which claimed that eating rice can easily lead to beriberi, stomach disease, high blood pressure, heart disease, kidney disease, and other diseases. It also claimed, vaguely, the nutrition in wheat flour is higher than in rice, and the physiques of people who eat wheat are all comparatively tall and strong. And the memo concluded, from now on, we should start step by step to eat less rice and eat more wheat. To me, seeing this kind of language being used in 1968 was quite jarring because it resembles so strongly the kinds of vague claims that we saw in Wu Xian's and the Shenbao article that we looked at earlier, both of which were published 40 or more years before this. The influx of cheap American wheat, combined with the concerted effort to change people's eating habits, seems to have had an effect. By the late 1970s, wheat consumption had grown to be not much less significant in Taiwan than rice consumption. And today, wheat represents about 45% of Taiwanese staples, while rice is about 55%. So to me, this is an example of how a common late 19th century prejudice against Chinese people, grounded in imperialist hubris, made its way into a scientific idea that is less obviously biased and therefore more pernicious. I think most reasonable people today would reject the kind of bald stereotyping that appears on the left side of this slide from a mid-19th century popular American source, when it says something like, the Chinese are as peaceful and inoffensive as we would suppose a nation of rice eaters would necessarily be. But they would be less bothered, I think, to read a 2023 article in The Economist called How to Fix the Global Rice Crisis that associates rice with diabetes and says Asian governments need to convince their people to eat less rice for the sake of their health and their nation's flourishing. And it's less obvious how anxieties about rice's glycemic index might have any connection with imperialism or racial prejudice. The Chinese language internet has all kinds of anxious posts like the one that's shown here asking whether white rice should be considered junk food, like eating pure sugar cubes. But I see both of these things as having a genealogy that traces back to that 19th century American context. I'm just looking at time here. I think we have time to look at one more example here, and that is the example of lactose intolerance. The road to lactose intolerance, being perceived as a common Chinese problem, began, like the idea of rice sickness, with the valorization of one particular element of Western diets of the late 19th century. Just as Western sources of the time had presented wheat eating as the key to a vigorous, powerful, inventive civilization, similar sources presented milk drinking this same way. And to give you an idea of what this milk boosterism sounded like in the US, this is a quotation from a long pamphlet on the healthfulness of milk by Samuel Crumbine and James Tobey, who were public health officials in the 1920s. You can see from the fact that Crumbine has a bronze statue of himself in front of the Kansas State House that he was well reputed. But in their book about milk, among the things that they said about it was, the races which have subsisted on liberal milk diets are the ones who have made history and who have contributed the most to the advancement of civilization. That's a lot to attribute to milk, but it wasn't just Americans who were saying things like this. There was also milk determinism in China, and so this is roughly contemporaneous. This is a 1924 article from the Chinese magazine Farmers Monthly, in which the author, Gan Rudeng, says essentially the same thing that Crumbine had said. He says, from history and empirical observation, science has proven that all of the races that drink ample cow's milk are more developed. Today's world leaders in physical, intellectual, and moral education all love the nurturing effect of cow's milk. And he concluded that stimulating the dairy industry was one way of saving China. So sort of an aspirational article about building up the dairy industry in China. Why were people so enthusiastic about milk? Well, for one thing, by this time, fresh milk was a prominent part of European and American diets. That had been true of dairy for a long time, but mostly it had been in the form of cheese, not drinking fresh milk. Cheese is more portable, and it stays edible longer than fresh milk. But by the 19th century came urbanization and concerns about declining child health in industrial cities. Refrigeration technology developed and spread to keep things cold for longer. And so drinking fresh cow's milk became a much more common phenomenon than it had been in the past. Accordingly, what Chinese sources in the early 20th century were recommending was usually drinking milk. It was yin niu ru, not eating it in the form of cheese or something else. And just drinking milk straight up as a regular beverage was new not only to Chinese people, but relatively new to Americans and Europeans as well. Now, as in the example of the Shenbao article about wheat, the writer of this Farmer's Monthly article about milk did not need to rely on Western sources for his information. Chinese nutrition scientists also strongly believed in the value of milk. Like their American counterparts, they thought of it as that rare and precious thing, a complete food. And what they meant by a complete food was it was something that contained adequate amounts of all the macronutrients that they'd identified as necessary for human flourishing. So it had enough protein, carbohydrates, fats, vitamins, and minerals. In nutrition science publications of the 1920s, foods are often broken down into their constituent macronutrients and then compared with one another. And in that kind of comparison, cow's milk often came out at the very top along with chicken eggs. And so the example that I'll give you here from Chinese nutrition scientists, this is again Wu Xian, whose Introduction to Nutrition textbook we saw earlier claiming that the diets he labeled Chinese produced light, slow-growing rats. Here's what he had to say about milk. He observed, first of all, that compared with Americans, Chinese people in his time did not get a lot of the protein or calories in their diets from milk. And so that's what this table is showing here. He's comparing data from surveys on American diets with data from surveys on Chinese diets. And what he finds is that in the category of dairy, none of the protein or calories was being supplied by dairy. But in the American instance, a fair bit of the protein and calories in diets was provided by dairy. So Wu then projected this state back into antiquity in a section of his book where he meditated on comparative diets and history. And he started this meditation comparing Chinese and Western diets by saying, well, Chinese cuisine developed earlier and it's more sophisticated than European cuisine. He writes that if you look at Western cuisine, it has, in his words, retained a savage tendency. Just look at the knives and forks they use at their tables. So even when they eat, it's kind of like they're hunting. They're still stabbing and slashing at meat. But, he went on, there is one way in which European diets differ from ours that bears paying close attention to. Europeans consume milk, and Chinese people do not consume milk. And he says, you can see milk used as food in the Christian Bible. In my country's classics, there is no record of consuming dairy. In recent years, he concedes it is occasionally consumed, but that's the result of European culture flowing to the east. Here, Wu Xian demonstrates that good scientists don't always do good history. Neither of the claims that I've highlighted here in bold is really true. Yes, dairy appears in the Bible, but not in the forms or amounts that were common in Europe and North America in Wu's time. It's a very different kind of context. And classical Chinese dietetic, medical, and culinary texts do include recipes that have dairy, all kinds of dairy, actually, not just cow's milk, but also goat's or sheep's milk, mare's milk, yak milk, human milk. Miranda has written about this and shown the surprisingly large amounts of milk in middle period medical formulas and other recipe books, in addition to this wonderful article about cheese making in late imperial China. So this milk-no milk distinction was not as sharp or absolute in antiquity as Wu made it out to be. Just as Chinese nutrition scientists in the 1920s reinforced the idea that rice was problematic, they also reinforced the idea that fresh milk was necessary for national progress. And I think for the sake of time, I'm going to skip over the next couple of slides so that we make sure we can finish on time. So by about the middle of the 20th century, this is where things stood. Many people in China, and particularly people with expertise in nutrition science, were very enthusiastic about cow's milk. They thought that drinking milk was a good way to improve diet and health, and maybe even the best way to improve diet and health. And they thought that Chinese people didn't consume enough of it. But because there weren't a lot of dairy cattle in China, there wasn't a quick or easy way to produce a lot of milk and make it widely available. It wasn't until the second half of the 20th century that the availability of milk in China and Taiwan changed significantly. And I'll address the Taiwanese case first, and this is very similar to what we saw with the wheat case. After the Second World War, American and European dairy producers started to produce much more milk than they were able to sell. And in response, new government programs purchased large amounts of milk from farmers and promoted its consumption by people who weren't already eating a lot of dairy, both domestically in the form of school lunch programs and making milk a central part of the meals that were offered in places like prisons, and also internationally. And internationally, this meant selling surplus dairy at a discount to allies in places like Taiwan and Japan. The US passed a law in 1954, Public Law 480, that turned the country into the world's primary source of food aid. And this slide is showing excerpts from the initial agreement between the Taiwanese and American governments after Public Law 480 passed. In 1956, Taiwan agreed to buy 5,000 metric tons of leftover milk products from the US for the equivalent of $5 million US. And so from this point, American milk started flowing over the Pacific toward Taiwan. And I say flowing, but it's that most of it was actually powdered milk, not liquid milk, so it wasn't really flowing. But it started making its way over to Taiwan. And within a few years, Taiwanese habits had changed strikingly. Average milk consumption in 1965 was 3 times as much as it had been 7 years earlier. Now, what about mainland China? In the People's Republic of China, milk remained relatively inaccessible throughout the years that Mao Zedong was in power. But the way that it was apportioned indicates how valued it was. When food was rationed, cadres, soldiers, and people living in cities had preferential access to milk. But the bottom line is that people in mainland China didn't have the kind of access to milk in the 1950s through the 1970s that people in Taiwan had. The historian Thomas Du Bois has estimated that in 1958, the average per capita consumption in the PRC was about 1 small cup per month, or barely 1% of the consumption rates in the Soviet Union. But since the reform and opening period began in the late 1970s, China's dairy industry has exploded. And you can see the sort of aspirations reflected in this propaganda poster from the 1980s, where this young child who's eating well and looking at all of the bounty on the table is sort of gazing longingly at a bottle of milk. And you notice that in the front here, prominent in the foreground, is wheat, right? Any statistic that you look at about milk production and consumption in mainland China over the past 40 years is astonishing. China now has the largest dairy farms in the world, with tens of thousands of head of cows. And some of them apparently are milked in these sort of large, almost like airport terminal-looking facilities. By 2008, Chinese consumption of milk had grown 1,700% compared with 1970. Between 1995 and 2010, consumption of milk and dairy quadrupled in urban areas and sextupled in rural ones. And like the reformers of the Republican period, PRC officials in recent years have tried to promote more consumption of fresh milk among Chinese people. Famously, Premier Wen Jiabao said in 2006, "I have a dream that every Chinese person, and children foremost, will be able to drink a jin of milk every day." So that's about 500 milliliters, or if, like me, you grew up in the backward US and only American measurements make intuitive sense to you, it's about 2 cups of milk every day. When the Chinese Nutrition Society formulated its nutritional guidelines in the late 1990s, it stuck closely to those that the US Department of Agriculture had put forth in 1992. The food pagoda illustration, produced to accompany the Chinese guidelines on the right side, bears an unmistakable resemblance to the USDA's food pyramid on the left side. And in particular, the dairy recommendation is consistent. Even the location of dairy products on the Chinese graphic is the same. Now, up to this point, we haven't seen anything in the milk story that resembles the role of beriberi in the rice story. Yes, people were suggesting that Chinese eaters ate too little dairy, but no one had associated this with a disease or a health condition. That changed. In the 1960s, as American and European dairy was washing over the globe, astute observers began to recognize that a lot of the people who were drinking milk for the first time did not like it. And it wasn't just that they didn't like the taste of it or the idea of it, it literally made them sick. When they drank milk, a lot of people outside of the US and Europe, as well as minoritized populations in the US, got symptoms like diarrhea, bloating, gas, stomach pain, and nausea. So this turned into a scientific question, namely, why can't some people digest fresh milk easily? Research into this question over the course of the 1960s led to some interesting discoveries and to what I think of as a pernicious invention. The interesting discoveries I've summarized on the left side of this slide, and they are that different people's bodies process milk differently. The vast majority of human beings, about 3/4 of the global population, stop producing the milk-digesting enzyme once they've been weaned from their mothers, or at least they stop producing it in great quantities. And in fact, that's true not just of most humans, but of most mammals, and that makes a kind of economic sense, right? It would be wasteful for your body to continue to produce an enzyme to digest a food that you no longer eat. And so digesting or not digesting large amounts of fresh milk easily is the normal, healthy default state of most adults, including most adults in China and Taiwan. Now, there was a genetic mutation thousands of years ago, or several genetic mutations, in a few communities that enabled members of those communities to continue to digest milk easily as adults, including communities in Northern Europe. And so the descendants of those communities have continued to be able to digest relatively large amounts of fresh milk to the present day. So those are the discoveries. Interesting. But here comes the invention. Because research into this physiological difference was initially conducted mostly by people descended from communities with high rates of the genetic mutation that facilitated milk consumption, in this case, white American and European scientists who could digest milk, they saw not easily digesting milk as a deficiency or a medical condition, and they called it lactose intolerance. Other terms have been coined to describe this normal, healthy state, and they all make it sound not normal or healthy. Hypolactasia, lactase insufficiency, lactase deficiency, for example. And similarly disparaging terms are used in Chinese, 乳糖没缺乏症 or 乳糖不耐症. And here's where I think we see nutritional imperialism at work. Something that is fundamentally just a difference, one way of being human, and in this case, the majority way of being human, gets turned into a deficiency or a disability. So who benefits from this idea that lactose intolerance is a kind of debility and that those who suffer from it ought to be helped to consume more milk? Well, lots of people, right? American dairy farmers sell over $500 million worth of milk to China every year, of course, pending, we'll see how that shakes out in the future with tariffs. But there's China's own burgeoning dairy industry, which depends on lots of domestic consumption. And then there are people who benefit from dealing with the so-called problem of lactose intolerance. The market for low lactose dairy products is enormous, and that's what's shown on the right side of this slide. This benefits companies that manufacture low lactose products, including Nestle, Coca-Cola, General Mills, and so forth. And it also benefits scientists who research solutions to the problem of lactose intolerance. So on the left side of this slide is Lieberthal-Rogel, who is supposedly the first genetically engineered calf who was engineered to produce low lactose milk by scientists at Inner Mongolia Agricultural University. I don't think this ever panned out because there was a huge amount of news about it when this calf was young, but after the calf grew up, it's kind of disappeared, and I tried to get in touch with scientists at Inner Mongolia Agricultural University, and they never told me what happened to Lieberthal-Rogel. But in any case, the point is there are lots of different parties who have a stake in promoting the idea of lactose intolerance as a problem. And just as some observers saw beriberi as a characteristically East Asian disease in the late 19th and early 20th century, lactose intolerance has in some ways come to be seen as characteristically Asian. This map from an article in The New Scientist, using modern political boundaries to show estimates of the prevalence of lactose intolerance, gives the impression that 100% of people who live in China, Taiwan, Southeast Asia, and Japan are lactose intolerant. As Miranda has observed, the reality is much more complicated than this. Having the genetic makeup associated with lactose intolerance doesn't necessarily mean a person will experience symptoms. Different types of dairy products have different effects. The degree of lactose intolerance varies over the course of a person's lifespan. There's lots of genetic variation within China, and so on. But this complexity gets lost in the belief that lactose intolerance is a national or racial obstacle to progress. And this is the very last example. Just a couple weeks ago, I got a text message from a Taiwanese friend about a new government program meant to get kids in Taipei to drink more milk. And so he got this letter from the city mayor announcing that from now on, each school child in the city will be eligible for 1 free bottle of milk per week paid for by local government. And it framed the duty of getting kids to drink milk in terms of national competitiveness, and explained that after milk was introduced in school lunches in Japan and Thailand, the average height of Japanese and Thai children increased. And that's what it's showing there with the images of the sad, short children on the left and the tall, happy milk-drinking children on the right. Now, to be clear, I'm all for governments providing nutritious food to children for free. But this rhetoric of milk as a panacea for national shortcomings, in this case literally shortcomings, and this framing at the very end as an afterthought, they say, well, if the child has lactose intolerance, they can get soy milk. We have a plan for that. But this framing of lactose intolerance as an unfortunate defect that requires special exceptions is, in my view, an expression of nutritional imperialism. So finally, what is the upshot of all of this? What do all of these examples of nutritional imperialism have in common? They began with a kind of Eurocentric hubris common in the early 20th century, and in this case, the hubris took the form of assumptions that the way well-to-do Westerners ate ought to be the norm for the entire globe. And the correlated orientalizing assumption was that Chinese foodways were utterly unlike Western foodways. Chinese people were rice eaters rather than wheat eaters. They were lactophobes rather than lactophiles. Scientists then linked supposedly inferior dietary choices with undesirable physiological states, whether that was beriberi or lactose intolerance. And helping Chinese eaters convert to the proper diet became a responsibility of both Western-trained scientists and modernizing political leaders. Knowledge about nutrition became part of the package of civilization and enlightenment that modern science had to offer China, kind of like the white man's burden, except in this case it was the white milk burden. Finally, as it turns out, there's money to be made from changing people's diets, and so the profit motive sustains nutritional imperialism into the present day. So in sum, I hope that we can find our way to a nutrition science that recognizes human diversity without pathologizing it. And to do that, I think a good first step is to recognize the unsavory origins of some of these seemingly neutral scientific concepts, to be able to identify nutritional imperialism when we see it. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. That was very informative, and I really appreciated learning a little bit more about more modern nutritional imperialism. But I was wondering if anywhere in your book, since we're talking about the origins, the way I understand this is it's a little bit later in the game for nutritional imperialism, and a lot of the underlying cultural assumptions around wheat leave out the whole problem of wheat from about 1200 to 1400 with the ergot problem, based on processing for different, classes. So upper level classes would have the pure wheat, and then the lowest peasant classes would get the ergot wheat and be later accused of witches. And then this would travel on to affect the maize trade, which is corn, and the extraction of maize from an sort of like a European processing view as opposed to an indigenous view. So this is all like a very long pattern. And around the time your research starts in the late 1800s, sorry about this, Mike, is like around the time they recognized that pellagra, which was a similar disease to beriberi, was not, it's not corn's fault, it's just the processing method, right? And then it leads into industrialization. So I see this as a very much longer process, and I wonder if you have goals to tackle that or loop that into your research, or if this is just kind of like supplementing that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm glad that you brought out that broader frame, because I think it's important. I think so. The disparagement and pathologization of what other people eat is definitely not something that only starts in the 1800s, right? I mean, we can see examples of that going much farther back. The reason I start where I do is because I think this particular example of the disparagement of other people's diets was very consequential in the formation of modern nutrition science, right? And that really is something that starts to develop in the late 1800s. And I think particularly with the advent of the discovery of vitamin deficiency disorders and sort of the turn towards the new nutrition in the 1920s, sort of the idea that rather than just figuring out what is the kind of minimum amount of various macronutrients that we need to keep people alive, let's find out what is the standard for optimum human flourishing, including vitamins of all sorts, and that's going to be sort of the new standard. So I think those really are modern developments, and that's why I start where I do. In terms of wheat and sort of investigations into the healthfulness of wheat, that's something that has kind of fallen outside of what I've done, and I'd like to know more about it. But I think the embedding of these sort of long-standing prejudices against other people's diets into scientific concepts, I really do think that's new in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. So that's why I begin where I do.
So thank you for a fascinating talk. It's a question about the flip side of nutritional imperialism, perhaps. And I think the scientific research is actually inconclusive or inconsistent on this. But I couldn't help but think about some of the more recent works that have come out regarding the higher incidence of breast cancer among Japanese women who were among the first cohort of, let's say, the mandatory school milk program. And the scientific research around that also seems to be prone or at least susceptible to the kinds of operations that you're identifying here, or albeit from the other side.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's an interesting time to be doing this project because in many ways, I think a lot of those sort of judgments and disparagements are now being flipped on their head. as meat-heavy, wheat-heavy diets have come under suspicion. And now there's this sense, you can find articles more recently published that are talking about the inherently greater healthfulness of traditional Chinese ways of eating and things like that. But often what they're doing really is just inverting those values, right? And they still retain that sort of sense of nutritional imperialism. It's just the groups, which group and which diet is on which side of it is different. And so I think it's in some ways it's progress, but in a more significant way, it really is not getting away from the central issue of sort of not pathologizing diets that are different, right?
Thanks for that. So I think a lot of us who work on imperialism will recognize the production of quote-unquote Western science through the pathologization of difference. But one of the things I was really interested in was how then nutritional science becomes itself institutionalized in the Chinese context. If you could say more about that. You talked about, you made references to earlier texts, and you talked about it as dietetic or culinary sort of prescriptive texts, and I'm wondering if you could just make that link a little bit more, how one transforms into Chinese nutritional science in the 1920s, say, with the example that you gave of that one scientist in particular.
Yes, yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So many of the first generation of nutrition scientists in China, like Wu Xian, he's kind of representative of that generation, were educated largely in North America, at places like Cornell and Michigan and Indiana and places like that. And that generation largely had not been educated in the traditional dietetic texts. So there is, there certainly are voices in the 1920s and 1930s that are arguing against that sort of nutritional imperialist perspective that, the Chinese nutrition scientists are promoting. But those were mostly not the folks who were brought on board by the Kuomintang or later the Chinese Communist Party as officials dealing with nutritional recommendations, right? And so mostly it was that generation that had studied in North America and then had trained others in China that became the members of the Chinese Nutrition Society, for example, right? And writing the articles for journals and things like that. So it's, interestingly, some of those people, like Zheng Ji is one of the members of this cohort. He lived a long, long time. He died at the age of 110 and was still writing books at 108. And at the very end of his life, like in the last decade or two of his life, he started intensively studying traditional Chinese dietetics. But in the 20s and 30s, he was writing exactly the same things that Wu Xian was writing about, the macronutrients and about the vitamins and sort of the deficiencies of the Chinese diet. And it's only sort of recently, toward the end of his life, that he came to the perspective that, there's value in that ancient dietetic tradition, and we need to bring that in as well. So I think in that early part, there's just not a lot of communication between those two groups.
Thank you very much. Fascinating talk. I wonder if there was any kind of agroecological pushback against the preference for wheat, considering that in a rice paddy, for example, you can raise fish, you can keep ducks. It seems like, hey, if we transfer over to doing wheat, you're going to lose out on useful sources of calories and nutrition that are ancillary to the rice production. I wonder if you'd ever encountered something like that.
I haven't, and I should say that the rice wheat discussion, there was sort of less of a strong push to convert farmland into producing a different kind of crop. And I think part of that has to do with there was lots of wheat available, through these international channels. And so you don't really see that, or at least I haven't seen that so much in those post-war sources. And interestingly, what you see more often recently is actually discussions of the environmental impact of rice as being worse than wheat because of how much irrigation it requires and sort of its water demands. So it's a really good question. I haven't seen anything like that, but it would definitely be worth looking for a little bit more specifically.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I have this belief in the past that we see Northerners to be taller, bigger than the Southerners, and also American-born Chinese, they are taller and bigger than the Chinese people, native. And you showed that Wu Xian's study showed the mice, they are different in size after eating wheat and rice. I guess you would draw a conclusion that the size is not what determines which is better, because otherwise those evidence seem to be quite compelling.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And couple of things on that. I mean, one is certainly in the context that Wu Xian is writing in, where you do have sort of widespread hunger and undernutrition, right? Just not enough calories. Smaller is, I think, a sign of less adequate nutrition, right? I mean, I think I would agree with Wu Xian and with you about that. I think, if we're thinking more generally, is it always better to be, heavier and taller than smaller? Can you be healthy at, small and short? I mean, I think, yes, of course, you can be healthy that way. But the broader point here about the sort of correlation with size, and Andrea Wiley has made this point. She's an anthropologist who works on milk in the U.S. and India and China a little bit. But the point that she's made about that is that when people correlate height in particular with something specific like milk, it's never the case that the only thing that has changed in the diets of people where average heights have gone up is milk consumption, right? And that would be true of Chinese children coming to the U.S., for example, or in this example of the Japanese children between 1950 and 1994. A lot of things changed in Japan between 1950 and 1994, besides that milk began to be included in school lunches, right? There are large changes in overall nutrition, in public health and sanitation, and all kinds of things, right? And so I think it's the sort of reductionist fallacy of it's this one element, right? It's the milk that has made people, larger and more robust. That is kind of problematic. And in the case of Wu Xian, no one on the planet was eating as sort of limited diets as his rats were eating, right? And so the idea that he's extrapolating from, the small rat and the big rat that has only eaten, wheat or has only eaten rice, that's not a sort of realistic proxy for an actual human diet, right? And so I think that's kind of where I see the problem in what Wu Xian is arguing.
I have a question from the virtual audience. Did you come across any explicit policies or tropes that directly contributed to attitudes on nutrition stemming from Yellow Peril xenophobic efforts during your research?
Okay, so tropes stemming from the Yellow Peril idea. Not specifically, although I suppose, this idea, this kind of anxiety about Chinese immigrant laborers subsisting only on rice. I mean, that really is a kind of Yellow Peril, narrative that suddenly we have all of these workers that can exist on this diet that white American workers cannot live on, right? I think that the anxiety underlying that is very much, of a piece with the yellow peril idea. And there's a scholar from the University of Berkeley who gets sent out at the very beginning of the 20th century to survey the diets, sort of weird diets, basically, for lack of a better word. And one of the diets that he's sent out to survey is the diets of the Chinese, because he is convinced, he has been told, that they eat only rice. And he's very surprised when he goes and he finds, no, actually, they have very balanced diets, and they eat lots of different things. But the idea that, that was surprising to him, I think, comes from this very entrenched idea about what Chinese immigrant laborers could subsist on.
I would like to thank Dr. Smith for her very intriguing talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.